Selamat datang ke podcast TBH atau podcast Temu Bual Berita Harian. Dalam podcast ini kami mengundang tokoh dan pakar dalam pelbagai bidang untuk mengupas topik ihwal semasa. Hari ini saya disertai co-host Encik Nizam Ismail yang merupakan editor Bersekutu Berita Harian. Apa khabar Nizam?
Baik, terima kasih.
Dan bersama kami di studio BH hari ini ialah pakar Timur Tengah, Dr. Clemens Che daripada Institut Timur Tengah, Universiti Nasional Singapura atau NUS. Dalam sesi kali ini, kami akan membincangkan tentang konflik Iran dan Israel yang baru-baru ini semakin tegang dengan kejadian yang berlaku. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Che. On 13 April, as we know, Iran launched missiles and drones on Israeli territory, its first direct attack on Israel. And Iran has said it is in response to a suspected Israeli strike on Iran's embassy compound in Syria on 1st April that killed several people, including Iranian generals. So as a start, could you bring us through the historical context of the conflict between Iran and Israel and how this has influenced the current state of affairs?
Sure. First off, thank you for having me here with Berita Harian, and I'm happy to be with you to answer your questions. Concerning the history of the conflict, and when we talk about it bilaterally between Iran and Israel, before 1979, there was some kind of tacit cooperation. Tacit meaning implied cooperation, not official, but under the radar, so to speak, between Iran and Israel. So under the Shah, before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, there was cooperation because both sides felt that each other could provide a valuable counterweight to their adversaries in the region. So, for example, Israel for Iran countered Iraq, a Ba'athist Iraq at that time, whereas Iran, in Israel's eyes, stood against at that time the leader of Arab nationalism, Gamal Abdel Nasser. So both sides felt that each other could play a role in countering their own rivals, and this would later go on to influence the kind of strategic thinking that their respective leadership had about each other. In particular, I would say that Israel developed this what they call a periphery doctrine, and this doctrine means that to put it in very simple terms, is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that is, to put it very, very simply. So that relationship developed over time, and of course it's kind of changed, and I say kind of after the 1979 revolution, because although it changed in rhetoric, so some of the speeches that Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, issued upon his ascension to power was very anti-Israel, but at that time, the cooperation between the two countries was still ongoing, but limited. So some of the things that, of course, very inflammatory remarks that Ayatollah Khomeini mentioned in some of his speeches, but under the ground, they were still working with each other, because at that time, Iraq was still under Saddam, and it was still a rival, to Iran. And we all know that throughout the 80s, we saw the Iran-Iraq war. And again, the whole counterweight idea, enemy of my enemy is my friend, is that idea still persists over the 80s. But by the time we reach the 90s and the early 2000s, when the main adversaries of this bilateral relationship, limited bilateral relationship between Iran and Israel, were eliminated, particularly Taliban in Afghanistan, and of course Saddam in Iraq went down as well in the early 2000s. And then this kind of rivalry between Iran and Israel was firmly established by then. So this rivalry and antagonistic relationship has carried on since then. So in a nutshell, it wasn't always about antagonism. It wasn't always about animosity, bad blood. There was some form of cooperation throughout, even in the early years of Khomeini. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. And then, as we know that this is the first time that Iran attacked Israel. Before this, they're using proxies like Hamas, Houthis, and the Hezbollah. So, what was the Iran's aim, and whether they have achieved on this their strategy? Attack directly to the state of Israel.
Yeah, and you're right, quite right. That is first kind of attack, launched directly from Iranian soil and targeted against Israel. When previously, most of these attacks happened through Iranian proxies, or what it calls its axis of resistance. And within Iran, they call it the ring of fire that protects Iran. So what does this imply about Iranian aims? First off, it's a very calculated response towards the Israeli bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus in Syria, which killed two top commanders of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. So Iran had to make a response, but it had to make a very carefully calibrated one. One that would not amount to an all-out war, and it did actually provide sufficient messaging prior to launching all these strikes, so that the West and Israel could have taken appropriate defensive measures. So in a nutshell, the response by Iran was very calculated. It aimed to make a public statement that it was not going to continue to stand by and do nothing. But it was also all about saving face. And it did so because, one, it did launch an attack, and two, these attacks were, of course, intercepted, as we all know from the media, with very minimal casualties or injuries. So it's a very carefully calibrated one, but that doesn't cancel out the fact that between December 2023 and March 2024, those 3 to 4 months, Israel had already, at that time, targeted many Iranian commanders and advisors from the IRGC. And this recent strike on Damascus, the Iranian consulate, that was, in a way, a move that forced the Iranian hand, because they were questioning themselves internally of their own intelligence, the capabilities of their own intelligence, and how Israel has managed to outsmart them, outwit them over this time. And then they, of course, made the calibrated response. So if they achieved their aim of saving face, they did. And of course, this face-saving measure also applies to how Iran is perceived by its own axis of resistance. That is not going to take any attacks from Israel lightly, in that sense. Yeah.
And then, like you said, that face saving. Do you think this is miscalculated by Iran, or it's just a show for them to show their strength in the region?
Yeah, definitely is a calculated response. Is a show of strength that it shows that Iran internally, but it's going to say that we are not shy of allies in the region. That's number one, and that means their own proxies. And this has carried on since, of course, October 7 attacks, and of course, Hamas has been receiving funding from Iran, throughout the 2010s, especially from Hamas's leader Yahya Sinwar has been receiving funds.
Yeah.
But Iran denied that it has asked Hamas to take action. So the funding is there, the training is there, but the decision making, on the other hand, on October 7, there was denial on the Iranian side. And if we come back to the more recent response by the Iranians, they came out. The Iranian chief of staff came out to say, after the attacks was done, that okay, we have done our part. The operations have been concluded, and we will do no further to escalate the situation in the region. Yeah.
How is likely Israel going to respond, and whether they're going to hit call for restraint.
Yeah, so that is the billion-dollar question that
Yeah.
is on everyone's minds at the minute. Of course, things could change in the next few hours. It could change in the next days or weeks. But the ball is in Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu's court at the minute. And you are right to say there have been external calls for restraint, especially from Washington, where Mr. Biden said that the US will not participate in the direct offensive against Iran. But at the same time, if you look at some of the statements made by Mr. Biden, he said that the support for Israel, and I quote, is ironclad, unquote. So, even though he has, made his point about restraint to Israel, there is no guarantee that Mr. Netanyahu will just sit still. So what we can expect, is also a very calibrated response from the Israeli side. And that means not going all out on the military offensive against Iran. They will have to get creative. And the question is really about how and when. How really some of the options that are presented quite likely in the war cabinet is against Iran would be cyber attacks, for example, or even more aggressive targeting of Iranian military commanders. So very specific kind of campaigns, military campaigns, rather than an all-out offensive. When? I think that's another question. So it could be in the next days, or he could prefer to wait out until the dust settles and then he comes in to deliver a blow to Iran. One thing that we have to bear in mind is that Mr. Netanyahu has to appease his own internal elements, meaning specifically the right-wing ministers in his cabinet, who will, of course, be pressing him to act. And these are the same right-wing ministers who have been providing racist remarks against Palestinians. They have been ordering more Jewish settlements in Palestinian areas. So, we see Mr. Netanyahu also in a very difficult position. And he would like to remain in his PM position, and that means self-preservation. He wants to preserve himself. So he is, I would say, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, if you like. So yeah, the likelihood is that he will make a very calculated response as well.
Israel has said that it will be up to them how they would like to respond to this. And what is and there have been talks about sanctions. Is that something which is on the table for Netanyahu?
You mean sanctions against Iran? I don't think it's up to him to enforce these sanctions, and Iran is already under sanctions to begin with. And I think there was a great deal of, it was a blow to Iran's economy, I think, when October 7 happened, because there was a fund that was meant to help the Iranian people, to lift them out of economic hardship, but that was cancelled out when October 7 happened, and there were links drawn between the Iranian leadership and the Hamas attack. So if you talk about sanctions, Iran is under no short of sanctions, and even a proposed kind of humanitarian fund, which was previously tabled but now cancelled, was another big blow to Iran. So I think they probably had enough of sanctions already. Yeah.
And you mentioned about October 7. What will be the immediate impact of this attack on the region, particularly on the ongoing Israel and Palestine conflict?
Yes, I think this is also an important question because some of the views that we are seeing out there argue that these latest developments of possible blown up war between Iran and Israel would overshadow what is happening in Gaza. My take is that it does distract a little, but they are connected. You can't deal with one without dealing with the other, and I've already mentioned in some of my earlier responses that Hamas was funded by Iran and given training by Iran. So there is connection to begin with. But going forward, if you are to talk about the Gaza situation and the responsibility of Hamas, you see that the Iranian link there. But besides funding, ideologically, it is not Hamas who is more attuned or aligned with Iran. It is the other militant group in that area, which is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which has a more aligned ideology with Iran in that sense. So this will prove to be costly if militancy and violence are going to be increased in that area, because at the end of the day, some of the decisions made are done by the leadership, but it is the people who suffer at the end of the day.
As you pointed out, it's the people who suffer. So what will be the impact on the victims of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which is ongoing?
Now, we talked about the possible escalation, and if this conflict, opens up or widens into multiple theaters of war, multiple fronts, then the humanitarian cost will be even larger. We're not just talking about, the over 1 million Palestinians caught and trapped in Rafah, but we're also talking about, Iranians themselves who are already under economic hardship, and if they face reprisals from an Israeli response, they would also be not just under economic hardship, but also victims of war. And I think this is the bigger question, because if you talk about humanitarian catastrophe, we are looking at a possible escalation in terms of more casualties. Yes.
Yeah, when you said about distraction just now, I think many international countries that worry that they will distract also the peace process and then the potential statehood of Palestine. So what's your opinion?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think, we talked about the links of the militant groups in Gaza, Palestine Islamic Jihad and Hamas, and their links with Iran. Now, we talked about how the historical evolution of the bilateral relations between Iran and Israel, and over time Iran became a strategic threat for Israel, even while Gaza is happening, and because of that perception within Israel that Iran is behind most of the instability in the region, and it is a strategic threat that has to be eliminated. How long it will take, that's another question, and that's another story altogether. But if you talk about Palestinian quest for statehood, a peace process, this would severely undermine, and disrupt and hinder the process, because of how the Israelis will be increasingly focused on eliminating Iran. And when they see that there are groups within Gaza who have links to Iran, that complicates the whole process, that hinders the whole process, that disrupts and in fact obstructs the whole road to peace, because then the focus is on eliminating threats and not finding a peaceful solution for the Palestinians. And we all know that the Palestinian question is a protracted and long-standing conflict over 100 years, and there has been no viable solution throughout this time, except for a window of opportunity in the 90s, which was then closed. And now we see this going into another direction, and possibly even further away from a peaceful solution, especially when you talk about how Iran complicates the whole situation towards a peaceful settlement. Yeah.
And Dr. Che, what about the potential long-term effects of this conflict and the latest developments on geopolitical relations and I guess the regional balance of power in the Middle East as a whole?
I think we have to understand it from two layers. First layer, and I think it is a much more global layer, is the US role. I think the US has taken a huge reputational hit when October 7 began and when they declared their support for Israel, and it has been, their moral standing has been lowered. That's for sure, and that comes on the back of previous doubts about relying on the US for security guarantees, especially from Arab partners in the region. So now when the same Arab partners look at the US and see how fast they have come to the aid of Israel, they are going to be having more doubts and not less, because we saw how fast the US has dispatched 2 carriers to the region when October 7 happened, and also more recently, how the US has helped to coordinate the interception of the drones launched by Iran into Israel. So the rate at which, or the efficiency and the speed at which the US came to the aid of Israel is going to cast more doubts on the US's Arab partners in the region, and that is one big implication, because now the US will have to think about damage control in terms of how to maintain that kind of partnerships with Arab partners in the region. The second layer I want to talk about is, of course, the regional dynamics of the Middle East. And that part, comes back to Iran, because Iran, I guess, today is the focus of the discussion. And Iran has been a long-standing concern for Arab states in the region. Not just for Israel, but Arab states of the region, because of their proxies and because of the axis of resistance, which have threatened to disrupt, for example, oil facilities by some of the Gulf Arab states, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But there have been efforts in the last few years to maintain lines of communication and dialogue with Iran. Between the Gulf Arab states and Iran, they have really intensified a lot of efforts to have some form of dialogue. And this has paid off, because if you have noticed, starting from October 7, the axis of resistance have so far not touched the Gulf Arab states. And this is in part due to the kind of negotiations, the kind of efforts to communicate and send a message that we want de-escalation, not escalation. And that is coming from the Gulf Arab states. So for them, they will try to stay out of this conflict between Iran and Israel as far as possible, as long as they get some kind of perceived guarantees that Iran will not, harass or attack some of their own facilities. So that's my response.
You have touched on the implication, the impact on the Middle East. How about Singapore? This conflict will impact Singapore, and then why does it matter to us?
Now that is even a bigger question here, and I think there's 3 ways of looking at it. If you're talking about where Iran is concerned, Singapore has always and consistently come out to say that the most important and vital waterways in the world should be free, and should be some freedom. There should be freedom to navigate these waters, and the most important of them all is the Straits of Hormuz, where 1/5 of global oil transits through this waterway, and we have stakes through the Straits of Hormuz. So the implications for us is, if this goes out into a full-blown war between Iran and Israel, and Iran in one scenario or another threatens to shut that waterway or disrupt, and they have been disrupting through their proxies right now, seizing different vessels, oil tankers. If it comes to disrupting the whole or closing the whole waterway, we will of course be against it, very much against it. And that's one part of the response. The second part of the response, if you're talking about our principal approach in international affairs, we have always stood by the rule of law approach, and we have always come out to say that we stand by international law, we stand by international humanitarian law. But since October 7 until now, where there is a chance of escalation because of the confrontation between Iran and Israel, there is this whole broad question about what international humanitarian law means and how is it applied. And then we will have to, at some point, make a statement as well. So I think, whether it's equally applied to everyone, international humanitarian is another big question, especially when we are firm believers of the rule of law, rules-based order, and international humanitarian law. So for us, I think this is another implication that Singapore has to think about, especially when it comes to the application of international law. The third one, and I think is the kind of whether or not there is a spiritual connection when it comes to Iran. And my answer is very little, because our own Muslim community is predominantly Sunni. That means that there's very little affinity with Iran. So to put it in a nutshell, that Iran-Israel bilateral confrontation doesn't really resonate with us as much as what is happening in Gaza, which has high level resonance, also because of the humanitarian catastrophe, the injustices, and the dehumanizing of Palestinians, not just during this ongoing developments in Gaza, but also across the historical timeline of the conflicts and the kind of injustices that Palestinians have suffered. That has more resonance than what Iran is doing at the moment. So yeah.
So clearly, whatever is happening in the Middle East and the latest attacks have some direct or indirect impact on Singapore. So before we close the session, any other comments from Dr. Che or Hassan?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we will have to, if we talk about the ongoing developments, we will have to to watch pretty closely what will happen. Like I said, right now the ball is in Mr. Netanyahu's court, and how he reacts and how the IDF reacts will determine whether it's going to be a tit for tat kind of pattern that happens in the next stages of the conflict between Iran and Israel. And if it is a tit for tat pattern, then we are talking about not just a cycle of violence, but we are talking about a downward spiral of into a cycle of violence. Because when just before October 7, we heard from the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He came out to say that the Middle East has never been quieter. And within days, I think his statement was cancelled out altogether completely. And we can expect that the Middle East will, some things will stay more or less the same. It's obvious, more often than not, it's the calculations that change. But, conflict remains, as we saw since October 7, it's been an ongoing cycle. And yeah.
With that, thank you Dr. Che for sharing your thoughts and for joining us today. Dan terima kasih juga kepada pendengar Berita Harian yang mengikuti sesi podcast hari ini, dan saya harap pendengar dapat sedikit pencerahan mengenai konflik tersebut dan kesannya kepada dunia dan Singapura. Jumpa lagi dalam podcast TBH seterusnya.